Morning. It's 3 minutes after 10 and we have quite a lot of important stuff to get through. But I want to begin by asking you a question to which I cannot quite believe the answer. I was tootling around London yesterday, as is my wont, and a little bit off my usual patch. And I encountered a flower stall that was obviously preparing for what must be the biggest day of the year for florists. It wasn't a shop, it was a stall, a street stall, where they were selling red roses in preparation, obviously, for Valentine's Day, which is, and you can thank me later if it's passed you by so far, lads, today. And I looked at the price thing. My family's away at the moment. They're back today, and I've got 2 daughters and a wife. So I thought, do you know what I might do? I might buy a huge amount of roses and then have them all in the house when they get in today while I'm at work. And that'll just be what a lovely Valentine's thing that is to do. So I went to the price. There was a little menu of prices up on the side of the flower stall, and I had a look at it. And I think I might have rubbed my eyes like something out of a cartoon. I honestly think I might actually. I'm about to mime it on a radio show. Let's look on that as a tribute to the late great Steve Wright, who always appreciated that sort of creativity, and to whom we'll be paying proper tribute later in the program. But I think I might have rubbed my eyes. I was sort of giving myself a little Eric Morecambe style slap around the chops because I thought that can't be. And as I'm looking at it, I appreciate that there are gradations of roses. Okay, obviously, the stuff you get from a petrol station forecourt and the stuff you get from a fancy florist are going to be different. Possibly not quite as different as you might imagine when you look at the comparative prices, but obviously I understand they're going to be different. So let us say that these were top of the range Valentine roses, right? How much for 10? Go on, have a guess. How much in pounds? How many of your earth pounds were they asking for 10? 10? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Top of the range, although I've only got their word for that. I've also got no reason to doubt it. 10 roses. Now, play the game. Obviously, I was struck by the price. I don't know yet whether I have conveyed the sense of shock being about how cheap they were or how expensive they were. But I suspect you've probably got a clue. But have a genuine guess, like a realistic low-end or high-end guess. There's not much point playing if you're just going to come across with a perfectly average suggestion. This was enough to make me rub my eyes, like Elmer Fudd, or I don't know, your favourite cartoon character doing a very cartoonish thing. Just let me know how much you think it was. I don't think there's a topic in it at this particular point in proceedings, because, you take it or leave it. You can pay it or not. It's entirely up to you. But let's just say I arrived at work this morning still reeling with shock. And that shock was immediately shared by all of my colleagues who came in with guesses that were, well, we'll play the game, shall we? I will remember, I promise, to reveal the answer sooner rather than later, but perhaps not straight away. We're moving into proper territory now, the proper phone-in, which is going to be about the story on the front page of one. I think technically the Daily Express is still a newspaper, at least for now. But this story, I think, merits attention because I'm interested in the ramifications of it. It's a story about a Tory MP having his home targeted by a pro-Palestinian protest. Now, obviously, depending on your politics or your laziness, you can describe it as a mob or you can describe it as baying, as indeed everyone on the right of the British media will no doubt choose to do. But if you're not on the right of the British media, you can describe it as a peaceful protest if you want. An accusation that he's backing war crimes in Israel. I think the Italian government have just passed a motion to stop sending arms to Israel on the grounds that they may be contributing to war crimes. So it's not what you'd call a fringe or an extremist position, but it is, of course, a controversial one. But I find myself, and also they seem to be a little ignorant, these protesters, because David Cameron, of all people, is currently leading the line upon calls for a ceasefire. David Cameron, of course. So you put me in this weird position, these protesters, of having warm words to say about David Cameron, a man who I hold in such low regard that he gets an entire chapter in my my book, How They Broke Britain, which incredibly 15 weeks after release is still at number 9 in the Amazon top 10 this morning. It's gone back up again. Even I don't understand that. It's like a third lease of life. But that's how low I hold him. He gets an entire chapter in How They Broke Britain, but he seems to me to be acting with integrity and a degree of courage on this. I know that many people would want him to go much further, much faster, and I know that many people listening to this program may balk at the notion of Israel ever being told to stop killing Palestinians. But he is moving to build a consensus at a security summit in Germany this week to lay the ground for a sustainable ceasefire, and it marks such a departure from where we were politically even 2 or 3 months ago, that I think it would be very churlish and foolish and footballification-ish to deny him some credit, or certainly some encouragement. So not only do these protesters put me in the position of having to say a few warm words about David Cameron, they also box me into a place where I think I have to stick up for Tobias Ellwood. His home in Bournemouth was besieged on Monday night for several hours. Now, besieged is also a loaded word. I've had Fleet Street on my doorstep once, which was an odd experience, given that my wife and I were both Fleet Street journalists at one point. But a footballer called Frank Lampard rang the show many moons ago in High Dudgeon. And because famous footballers are the sort of jackpot, really, for tabloid media, he was very upset with me. And I had the extraordinary experience of having people from newspapers knock on my door. Luckily, my wife was in. My wife answered the door. She was probably expecting a delivery. She usually is. And she had been on doorsteps with the journalists that were now on our doorstep, asking me if I had any comment to make about the story that I had sort of unwittingly got myself caught up in. But were we besieged? I don't know if we were. We asked them politely not to bother the neighbours, because we were both au fait with what the modus operandi is when you're doorstepping someone, and it was only 2 of them. But would you use the word besieged? So I'm not going out until they've gone. If there were 100 members of the public in the street outside my house, I think I would use the word besieged. I certainly wouldn't want to run the gauntlet of their abuse. I am going to ask police officers, past or present, what they think should have been done in this context. One of the people who resigned from the Labour Party in protest at Keir Starmer's elevation and who stood in the 2019 general election for Labour against Tobias Ellwood was there, one of the leaders reportedly of this behaviour, protest, siege, whatever you want to call it. And I'm conscious, really, of 2 things. I'm conscious of privilege, all right? And that's why I'm interested in what your thoughts are on this story. I talked yesterday a bit about bias. I think you have to own your bias. I am biased against rabble-rousing, lying racists, for example. Very, very biased against them. And the more of them end up in our government, the more biased I become against that government. Some people love them. They're also biased. They are biased in favour of rabble-rousing, lying racists. So I own my biases. Owning your privilege is rather harder. So it is not beyond the realms of possibility that a baying mob of far left or far right protesters could turn up outside my house, right? I mean, I think it's highly unlikely, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And I cannot look you in the eye and tell you that has no bearing whatsoever upon my opinion that nobody should ever have protests outside their own home. It seems to me to be a line that should not be crossed, but whenever I'm walking down the stairs to the studio in the morning, planning, or sometimes, of course, we haven't even decided what we're going to talk about, but on the days when we have, I try and look in the mirror. Not literally. I do that at 10:30. I try and look in the mirror and say, is this the opinion you would hold if your life had turned out differently? Or is this the opinion you would hold if you'd been raised differently or if you hadn't been adopted? I know that's a weird thing to do, but it keeps me honest and it keeps me fresh. And I suddenly realised that my deep conviction that you never protest outside a public figure's home might have something to do with the fact that I am myself a very, very, very minor public figure. So I don't know for sure, which is quite frustrating, to be honest with you. I don't know for sure. I do know that even when Jacob Rees-Mogg had a crew, a crowd, a mob on his doorstep, my sympathies and support went to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Imagine how tiny the pigeonhole is in which you would file circumstances in which my sympathy and support would go to Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the most ridiculous and dangerous people ever to assume power in public life in this country. Dangerous because he's so stupid. And yet, when people turned up outside his house, which I think some of his children were inside at the time, I just felt it was outrageous. Now, I'm going to throw something else into the mix, which we may or may not explore further later in the programme, but which will certainly be part of this conversation. And that is the level of outrage and heartbreak about what has already happened in Gaza, what is happening in Gaza, and what Benjamin Netanyahu appears determined to do next in Gaza. The prospect of war crimes being committed in the context of aid and food being prevented from reaching the people who need it has already been raised in the House of Lords, also by David Cameron. Tobias Ellwood, albeit that he is usually a very full-throated supporter of Israel, has recently criticised Benjamin Netanyahu. They kind of all are, to be honest with you. There's no pleasure in being proved right when thousands of people are dying. But the idea that this would reach a point where many, many people who started in a position of full-throated support will no longer be able to sustain full-throated support seems now to have been reached. The list of people calling upon Netanyahu not to go into Rafah is long and growing. So Ellwood is a supporter of Israel, and the frustration of people who want a ceasefire and yet feel that they're not really allowed to say so without being accused of anti-Semitism, or they're not really able to find any platform from which they can put forward this position with passion and power, or they feel that the massed ranks of the UK media are stacked against them and they feel that they can't find a way in which to be heard. If they had stopped the traffic on the Strand in the manner of Just Stop Oil, I think I'd be supportive of them. I think I would. But you can't protest outside people's homes, can you? One of my strangest ever experiences on social media came during the do you remember those riots when Boris Johnson didn't come back from his holiday? The London riots. Was it 2019? When were the big? There were some big riots. It's longer ago than that, isn't it? I forget why they were in the news today, but I remember. I'm rarely completely blindsided by social media reactions, but I tweeted something about don't go out tonight and start nicking stuff or looting, because however angry you are, it's not worth having that sort of black mark on your record. And I got rinsed by considerably younger people than me, whose anger I had completely failed to acknowledge. So, am I missing something here? Are there any circumstances ever? Are the grievances of people desperate for a ceasefire in Gaza so acute that they have the right to congregate outside an MP's home, his private home, his constituency home? I think it's really rank behaviour. But I acknowledge that I could be wrong. I don't think. I mean, who would be in favour? Well, let's find out. You think it's fair enough, but you need to tell me why. And you know how it works. If your arguments are strong and your aim is true, you may change my mind. But I can't currently conceive. 2011, sorry, not 2019. I'm going mad. I can't currently conceive of getting to the end of this hour in a position where I'm fully in favour of protesters turning up outside the home of anyone they don't like the look of. So is this a line that should never be crossed? Or is this an issue so loaded and unique that people feel they have little or no choice but to take extraordinary steps? 0345 6060 973. I mean, and how does it work as well? It's not a world I know much about. How do you find yourself outside Tobias Ellwood's house on a Monday night? I don't want to make a crass joke, like wasn't there anything decent on telly? But is it arrogant of me and contemptuous of me to say you shouldn't be doing that, because what you hear is me saying it's not? I mean, it is a huge deal. You're talking about the deaths of thousands and thousands of innocent people, 17,000 orphans now in Gaza. God knows how many more bodies under the rubble. People who feel a visceral need for a ceasefire, 12,000 dead children. But does that ever translate into the right to stand outside an elected British politician's house and shout forms of abuse? Maybe it does, but you're going to have some good arguments. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 20 minutes after 10. 23 minutes after 10. Let me read this from Adam in Manchester. Close your eyes and imagine for 2 minutes that you're a Palestinian born in an occupied territory, and as you grow older, your family is whittled away while the world stands by and listens to lie after lie after lie. I think people have had enough and are proving the point that if we all stand up, change can happen. It's the extraordinary things that are flagged up these days. I've read that, but I completely disagree with it in the context of defending protests outside a British politician's house. The only caveat I've got, the only thing holding me back from a complete condemnation of what they've done, is a question I'd rather be asking in different circumstances. And that question is, if you're lying awake at night, worrying about family in Gaza, or worrying about fellow humans in Gaza, mourning the dead, grieving for and with the orphans, where can your voice be heard at the moment? And yet even then, even if the answer to that is nowhere, it can't be outside Tobias Ellwood's house, can it? It just can't be. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Quincy's in Tunbridge Wells. Quincy, what would you like to say?
Absolutely, we should claim the right to protest outside everybody's house, anyone's house.
Really?
And especially if you choose to run for an electoral office, and we, the public, pay for you, then we want you to hear and to speak for us and be the mouthpiece for us. You're not doing that right now. Tobias Ellwood and a whole lot of other people are not doing that right now. And the reason I particularly support
he's not though, is he? He's in Parliament essentially to put forward his own position, not yours.
No, I don't believe that.
You don't live in Bournemouth East. To state the bleeding obvious.
Yeah. I believe in a democracy that they speak for us. And,
no, well, you need to understand, forgive me for sounding patronising, but you need to understand the difference between a delegate and a representative. He's not a delegate. And the only person that he speaks for are the constituents of Bournemouth East who elected him, and the ones who didn't. You can't believe this. You can't believe that it's okay for anyone to turn up outside anybody else's house and start shouting the odds.
I do, because there are kids being murdered, and I want your kids to hear that. I want your kids to know that. I want you to look at your kids. When you hear me outside protesting, I want you to look at your kids and think about the kids who are dying. I want your kids to pull at your sleeves and say, "Daddy, is this real? Is this really happening?"
I think they'll be too busy being frightened, won't they?
Well, listen, we don't want to talk about the dichotomy of fear in children if we're looking between your kids and kids in Palestine.
No, of course we do. It's not a dichotomy of fear. It's your imagined reaction of what non-existent children would do in specific circumstances, and I'm suggesting that you're wrong. Most 8-year-olds are going to be more concerned about someone shouting abuse at their dad outside their sitting room window than they are about a story that they're not terribly aware of on the other side of the world. I mean, let's not be silly, Quincy.
I understand what you're saying.
Have you ever met an 8-year-old?
But the older kid who's actually getting his education.
You don't know how old Tobias Ellwood's children are, and you've already qualified your full-throated support for all protests outside all people's house by saying, well, only if the children are old enough.
Not just Tobias Ellwood. No, not only if they're old enough. Not only if they're old enough. You can get over somebody protesting outside your parents' house tonight. how long is it going to take you? Can you imagine the trauma of the kids right now in Gaza?
Yes, of course I can. I talk about it all the time. I've already talked about it this morning. But how is their plight helped by terrorising Tobias Elwood's children?
We have to. I think it's the only way. I think the only way that these people are going to listen is if you bring it to their door. That's what I think. I'm not
listen.
about violence.
No, but you can't guarantee that, can you? And violence outside someone's house is a hell of a lot more likely if there's a shouting mob there than if there isn't. But let's say
I wouldn't advocate violence against anybody in their home or outside.
Verbal violence, forms of protest. You know
I
that.
don't like you see that. I said that at the outset. I don't believe in abusing people in or outside the home anywhere else.
So what can you do? Where's the line? Can it be permanent? Can I stay there forever?
No, but
how long
you
then?
Don't need to be there permanently, but we need to let them know that we know. I want you to know on your doorstep.
Well, do it outside Parliament then.
Think about it.
Do it outside Parliament. Do it outside the constituency office.
Outside Parliament is not their offices. It's not their home. I want them to know it at their home. I want you to know. I think it's important.
I think I disagree with you very, very strongly.
I understand, James, but I'm sorry this time.
No, it's fine. It's important to have these conversations. So the scale, another problem I've got with what you said is that all of your arguments are based upon the horrors of what is currently happening in Gaza. And yet your opening gambit was that anybody should be allowed to protest outside anybody's house. What about absolute nut jobs like anti-vaxxers? Should they be able to go and protest outside the Secretary of State for Health's house?
Anti-vaxxers are dealing with something that isn't an existential. It isn't an existential.
No, but they're adamant that it is, Quincy. They're absolutely adamant that it is.
Well. Anti-vaxxers won't be able to demonstrate to me how 124 Palestinians or British.
No, you can't. You can't wriggle. You can't dodge this. You're either in favour of everybody's right to protest outside anybody's house, which are pretty much hang on a minute. Those are pretty much the exact words you used when you rang in.
I do, and I still agree to that.
So that includes flat earthers. That includes conspiracy theorists. That includes rampant anti-Semites or Islamophobes.
I'm saying in the case of an urgency like this is
well, then you're qualifying your opening words, and urgency becomes subjective. Should the English Defence League be able to protest outside Diane Abbott's house?
I think the English Defence League should be able to protest any time, anywhere that they like.
So they should be able to protest outside.
By the way, James. Quincy is black, so. I've always advocated that everybody should have the right to protest anytime, anywhere.
Well, I find that extraordinary, mate. So you white supremacists protesting outside the homes of black politicians on the grounds that A, they shouldn't be here, and B, they certainly shouldn't be in power. Outside the homes, you don't believe that.
I don't support their view, but I do.
No, I know that, but you don't believe that. You don't believe that there should be 100 people camped outside Diane Abbott's house telling her to go back to Africa. You don't believe that.
That is abusive. That's not my position.
They've accused Tobias Elwood of supporting genocide. That's abusive.
Am I supporting Tobias Elwood? Am I saying that he supports genocide?
I don't know what you're saying. You're supporting the people that are outside his house by saying that you support any protest outside anybody's house.
I support any protest outside anybody's house, especially if you're an elected official, yes.
But you don't support the Ku Klux Klan congregating outside Diane Abbott's house, do you?
Do I? Sorry, I missed that.
You don't support white supremacists congregating outside Sadiq Khan's private home.
I think that they should be able to congregate anywhere they like.
Okay, right. That is where we categorically disagree. I can see some logic, perhaps, in the argument about the urgency of the situation, but as I think we both realised halfway through that conversation, that's too subjective to be effective. So you have to either be blanket in favour or blanket against. You can't say it's okay sometimes, but it's not okay other times. And I suppose it's to your credit that you didn't try and quibble. You ended up being in favour of white supremacists protesting outside the homes of black politicians, which I find extraordinary. But then I find the protest outside Tobias Elwood's home extraordinary as well. 10:31 is the time. What do you reckon? Quincy made some good points, and he made them well. But it can't ever be acceptable to target the private homes of democratically elected politicians in a verbally violent and potentially physically violent way. And just this line here. He was indoors with his sons, Alexander and Oscar. I don't know how old they are, but the idea that he's going to suddenly change his view on Benjamin Netanyahu's foreign policy or give his sons a crash course on Palestinian rights as a consequence of these people shouting outside his house and holding up pictures of their dad's face with bloody handprints on it just seems to me to be, to say the least, unlikely. It feels a little inappropriate now to remind you that we're still trying to work out how much a bunch of roses costs on Valentine's Day in central London, but I will reveal the answer to you at some point. 10:32 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 10:36 is the time. It's a bit philosophical, isn't it? So is it ever acceptable to protest outside a politician's private home where his partner or her partner and children will live, because you're protesting outside their home as well? I think that's the crux of my position on this, but that puts me in the stupid position of saying, well, if they're not in, if only the politician's in and the family aren't in, then it's okay. And I don't think I believe that either. But if your answer to the question is yes, sometimes, I think you've lost, which is why Quincy, when he said always, ended up to my ears sounding so ridiculous, and yet clearly not to his ears. The idea that anybody can protest outside anybody's home whenever they want. And remember, there are other people in that home who are not public figures, who are not politicians, who are not prominent. I don't know. It just seems to me to be a line that we should never endorse the crossing of. And yet there is a small part of me that recognises the frustration at the moment of Palestinian solidarity and just a deep desire to see people, to see the killing stop in Gaza, feeling that they're squeezed out of public discourse almost. Although Keir Starmer's got another problem here. I'm just reading about another Labour candidate who has invoked some of the oldest and most pernicious anti-Semitic stereotypes in a book that he wrote when he was a councillor. He describes Jewish oligarchs who run the media and who fiddle the figures to fix elections in their favour. There's even a character in this book, a Jewish character called Sammy Katz, who he describes as having a proud nose and curly hair, before painting him as a malevolent, stingy, snake-like Jewish businessman who exploits immigrant workers for profit. It turns out this Labour candidate also used to publish a local newspaper where one of his columnists actually boasted about being an anti-Semite, as well as arguing that black people have lower IQs than white people and praising Enoch Powell as a great man. This Labour candidate defended that columnist by calling him a distinguished... It's not a Labour candidate at all. It's Boris Johnson, the former Tory Prime Minister, who many people currently baying for the blood of Labour candidates secretly recorded expressing unacceptable anti-Semitic views, are also calling to be reinstalled as a senior politician in the United Kingdom. I think I should probably remind you of this again, because the conversation can tend to be incredibly hard to follow in this country at the moment. But a former Conservative Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when a shadow minister, wrote a book in which he evoked some of the oldest and most pernicious anti-Semitic stereotypes in existence, describing Jewish oligarchs running the media and fiddling the figures to fix elections in their favour. He went on to describe one of the main characters in the book as having a proud nose. And what the hell does that mean? And curly hair, before portraying him as malevolent, stingy, and an exploiter of immigrant workers for profit. He also published a notoriously racist columnist called Taki Theodorakopoulos, who has boasted of being an anti-Semite, as well as writing about his support for the Waffen-SS in the context of the Second World War. That's Boris Johnson for you. Okay? Not a candidate that you've never heard of until this week, when the Daily Mail published secret recordings. This is published in books and magazines. A magazine in this case that Boris Johnson was actually editing. So I mention that partly to highlight the madness of some of the coverage that's around this week, but also to highlight the double standards that lead people to think they have no choice but to take extraordinary steps. And to you, I say, take extraordinary steps, but don't take this one. You can't congregate outside someone's family's home to make a political point. You just can't. I haven't had any calls yet of police officers. Surely the police in this case, for once, I wasn't there. I'm always wary of criticising the police's behaviour at events I didn't attend. But, I mean, you'll remember they carted Charlotte Lynch off from a Just Stop Oil protest or an environmental protest when she was only there to report on it. So how can you be carting off journalists from one protest and leaving actual protesters in situ outside a politician's home in another? 0345 6060973. Paul's in Sheffield. Paul, what do you think?
Hello, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
So I think you've changed the kind of framing of the question quite accurately, because you have to consider it as how would you feel if it was any issue, if it was a politician you supported, because if you wouldn't accept it against someone that you supported, then you shouldn't accept it against someone that you disagree with.
That kind of thinking will never catch on.
Well, we can only try. It reminds me of when people were like over the moon that Nigel Farage had a milkshake thrown at him. Now, I don't like Nigel Farage as a political actor, but I don't think anyone should be assaulted in that way. And people protested, I think, outside Boris Johnson's house on the morning after the Brexit result, which, with a fair wind behind me, I could have been tempted to join in, but I still would have been horribly in the wrong. Absolutely, yeah. And I think, regardless of anyone's political views, I think in this country we should be defending people's peaceful enjoyment of their private residence.
That doesn't seem to me to be a controversial statement, and I suppose the response is, and I say this glibly, but also seriously, why don't you care more about the children in Gaza?
I think if the past few years of government in this country has taught us anything, it's that we have to maintain our standards at home and in our own political environment in order to kind of advocate for better standards internationally. Because if we let our own standards slip, that opens the door for wider problems.
And people like the person who was indulging in those vile anti-Semitic tropes in a published novel not long ago end up calling for Donald Trump to return to the White House, because once morality is completely abandoned, you don't really get to control how it makes its way back into public life. So you just don't go there. You sound a bit Michelle Obama, don't you? When they go low, we go high. But it's actually important to do that. Otherwise, everybody ends up in the gutter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to protect our own standards at these times.
And that is immune to the accusation that this issue is so urgent and so important and so emotive that you are prepared to pause your principles or give a free pass to this protest, because in doing so, you have to be morally consistent, give a free pass to all other protests as well. Thank you, Paul. Debbie's in Milton Keynes. Debbie, what would you like to say?
I feel like what they did outside this person's home, I think they have a right to protest outside his home. If they feel like they're being ignored, or if, the whole thing hasn't been debated or discussed enough, and things, when it doesn't feel like anything's being done about it, people get frustrated. So,
they do, but it's the home. Because I'm a great believer in pointing out that, for example, environmental protests only get noticed by most of the media when they find a way of discombobulating the usual suspects, whether they're throwing soup at a painting or sitting down in the middle of the road. And I think, construct a defence of those tactics. But it's somebody's home, Debbie. Just imagine it was your home and someone didn't like your opinions.
Right, it's not about my opinion, though. That's the whole point. I mean, there's a lot.
It is about your opinion. It's about Tobias Ellwood's opinion. Okay.
So there's a lot of people suffering out there. There's a lot of politicians that understand that this thing is going on. These deaths, these children dying, these vulnerable people being killed.
Yes.
Right, and nothing is being done about it. Nothing. It doesn't appear.
Well, again, that's not true. I mean, the International Criminal Court has warned that Israel could face war crime charges if it pushes ahead with an invasion of Rafah, and even David Cameron, who you put me in the very uncomfortable position of having to now speak warmly about, is leading international efforts in Munich this week to assemble an international consensus on calling for a truce that he hopes and intends would turn into a permanent ceasefire. So you can argue too little, too late, but Tobias Ellwood isn't even a minister anymore.
Right. Personally, I don't know who this Tobias is. I don't know.
Well, how can you be in favour of protesting outside his house then, Debbie?
All I can say is, if he's a parliamentary minister, and he has influence and can probably change and sway the minds of others to help stop this massacre, then, okay, we're going to bring it to your door and let you see. Please, listen to the masses. Listen to the people. Please.
Well, what about the people who disagree with you? Why shouldn't he listen to them?
He can.
But they don't have to protest outside his house. I mean, you're like Quincy, well, you're not actually, because you seem to think that some causes merit this kind of behaviour.
But you know something, I personally, if I had the guts to go outside and protest, or if I had the time, I probably would protest. I spend 40 to 60 hours working a week, right? And mostly, I have to just listen to the news constantly, in my car, whatever. That's the only time I feel like
I hear you. No, I understand you. And we're constantly urging people to get more engaged in politics, but there are limits. And do you recognise that in order to support this action, you also have to support white supremacists congregating outside the homes of politicians of colour?
We already know they're quite violent people.
Well, as long as they promise to be peaceful. As long as they promise to be peaceful, you're
throwing bombs. They would be probably doing all sorts of things.
But you can do the ifs and buts. But the point is, you're in favour of the principle of protest outside a politician's home. You don't get to decide, once you're in favour of that principle, what causes are okay and what causes are not. Do you want to answer a much lighter question, Debbie, before you go?
Go on.
How much do you think those roses were?
You asked me a question I don't even know the answer to.
10 roses in a flower stall that I walked past yesterday. 10 roses, top of the range roses. How much for 10? Right. Go on.
Do you know what?
What?
As the price of living has gone up, it's probably like 25 quid.
How much?
25 quid.
Not even close. Not even on the same dartboard, Debbie. I'll tell you how much they were after this, but I don't think you'll believe me. Dear James, this is all very serious. The only reason why I'm still listening is I want to know how much the roses were. There you go. That's how it works. There it is. Thank you, Sam, for your honesty, albeit for your mildly insulting analysis of the programme. £75. I have to tell you now, because you've started being silly. You're just sending in ludicrously high figures. Who sent 230 quid? You guys, £23 a rose. It's not impossible. Are they the most expensive roses in the country? That's the next question I've got for you. So I saw 10 roses for sale for £75. I don't want to embarrass the retailers and the vendors. Good luck to them in a cost of living crisis if you can find people who are going to drop 75 quid. The thing was, I wanted to buy 30 so that I'd have 10 each for the ladies in my life, my wife and my 2 daughters. And I was prepared to spend a few quid, right? Feeling like a bit of a high roller. £225 for 30 flowers. Absolutely no chance whatsoever. But can anyone can anyone beat that? Can anyone beat £7.50 a rose? And it has to be for a bunch. Although, to be fair, they were selling single ones for £7.50, so there wasn't even a discount for buying 10. For buying bulk. Maybe I'm out of touch. I buy flowers quite a lot. I like to buy flowers. I like to buy flowers when I'm not in trouble, because I don't want to be the cliched guy who only buys flowers for his wife when he is in trouble. So I like to buy flowers quite a lot. But £75. Oh, crikey. We think we found someone selling 12 premium roses for 150 quid. Oh, 10:53 is the time. Back to the rather more important question of whether it is ever acceptable to protest outside an elected politician's house. A law-abiding elected politician's home, family home, where other family members live. Alan's in Manchester. Alan, what do you think?
Well, if it was law-abiding, Johnson and Sunak wouldn't be there, but that's a moot point. No, it's not acceptable, James, and it's where do you draw the line?
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Where do you draw the line? You can protest, you can You can write to your MP, you can email your MP, you can ask to see him at his constituency office. But the 2 points I wanted to make, James, was we've had 2 MPs killed in this country, assassinated, Joe Cox and David Amos.
Yes.
And I think we had another one. One was attacked, seriously wounded by a knife. And you are going to get nobody standing, for a position of office, like an MP or a councillor. It's just not worth it, because the abuse they get on social media, it's absolute poison. And you're going to get no one doing it. So all our freedoms that we take for granted, including the right to protest, you're going to have no one standing, because it will become that bad. I mean, okay, it's Gaza today, and we all know how emotive that is.
Yes.
But when that becomes the norm?
When the protesting outside somebody's home becomes the norm. What do you think the police were playing out then? Because this is not a programme that routinely puts the boot into the police without having all the details of an allegedly controversial deployment. But what do you think they were playing at? Because it seems to me fairly obvious that this shouldn't have been permitted to continue for as long as it did.
Well, I don't know the details,
no,
James.
Fair enough. This is a radio phone-in show. Since when did we need details to have a strong opinion, Alan? Well, since about 2012. No, but I mean, the thing is,
look, were the police occupied somewhere else? Was it I don't know.
You need to send in. You've got 80 to 100 officers there. Then to make any meaningful move along order, you'd have to go in fairly mob-handed, actually. That's another very good reason why it's important to have all the details before you offer up pungent opinions about these kind of things.
Tobias
Sorry, mate.
Tobias Elwood comes across, a fairly decent guy. And it don't matter. I don't think he's an extremist. Or right, I don't think he's sort of
fairly full-throated in his. He's been fairly full-throated in his support of Israel, although he's latterly been critical of Benjamin Netanyahu. He's also the politician who came to the. You've mentioned murdered politicians. He's the chap who came to the aid of the murdered police officer, isn't he, at the House of Commons? He was the one in whose arms that I think the officer died.
It's going to be, like I said, James, it's an emotive subject, so it's very emotive.
Yes.
But if it becomes the norm to protest outside an MP's house, James, you will get nobody standing. The thing is, you will put your family first every time.
You would imagine so, wouldn't you? And yet, the necessity of being able to criticise politicians very, very robustly is not only essential to democracy itself, it's essential, obviously, to my livelihood. But there are lines, and I guess the closer you are to those lines, the more important those lines become. 10:57 is the time. Thank you, Alan. And Layla is in Camden. Layla, what would you like to say?
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to say that I think this whole question, this whole kind of line of reasoning, which says, it's not okay for the Ku Klux Klan to protest outside Dan Abbott's house, so it can't be right for these people to protest outside Tobias Elwood's, is not the right way to think about it. It's just every protest has to be judged on its own merits, depending on the situation.
By whom?
Well, let's put it this way, right?
No, let's first of all, let's establish who's making that judgment, because that's crucial to your point.
Society in general.
Okay, well, society's judged this. It's wrong.
Those of us who are talking about it. Who's judging it as wrong? I think, the reality is that the situation in Gaza couldn't be more grave, right? There's probably an unfolding genocide. It's utterly exceptional. And exceptional times are call for exceptional measures. So the police, I don't know exactly the details, but it looks like they probably made the judgment that there's a right to protest and it's qualified. And you have to decide on each case.
It's just as likely as the last caller said, that they didn't have the bodies that they'd have needed to make 100 or 80 protesters move along. So
but
let's
that's
both
by
avoid.
the by.
It's not by the by. They may well have wanted to move the protest along, but decided that they couldn't.
I'm saying as a matter, but the point of principle here is there is no hard and fast rule. You have to look at each situation on its own merits. So like in 100 years' time, let's imagine you're reading a history book about this time, in history.
Yeah.
What will people think about these protesters? They may well think, those people took a stand against something that was
but you can take a
unconscionable.
stand in a million different ways, Layla. You're glossing over the relevance, the salience of this being the home of 2 children who were in the house at the time.
But Tobias Elwood is not a private citizen, is he? I mean,
he is a private citizen. He's a public figure, but we're all private citizens, with the possible exception of the king.
What I mean is he's not, because he's
He
a
is.
public official.
No, he's a
That's what I
public
mean. He has
figure.
official function, right?
I'm a public figure. Are people allowed to protest outside my house?
You're not an elected official, James, much as you might want to be.
No, I categorically don't want to be. But imagine who you have to hang out with, even at lunchtime. Think of so every elected official's private family home is a reasonable site for a protest.
Depends. This is what I'm trying to say. It depends.
Yes, but you can't say it depends unless you tell me who's making the decision, and it can't be you. I will decide what's allowed and what's not allowed. Yes, I am listening. You listen.
Decisions like this. So the courts make decisions like this all the time, right?
Yeah.
So people go and assert a right to protest that might have been shut down, and the courts will look at the circumstances of the case and decide, was the protest legitimate in these set of circumstances. So that's how it works. That's how protests work. You can't have a hard and fast rule.
No, and as both enormous fans of freedom of speech, we can agree to disagree. And I should quote Dorset Police. Officers attended the scene and liaised with the organisers to ensure people could exercise their right to protest legally and safely without causing significant or ongoing serious public disorder, serious damage or serious disruption. We have a duty to ensure those involved act within the law and ensure the local community can go about their lawful activities. The group left the area by around 8:50 p.m. So that would seem to support Layla's position, even as I argued with it, that it is a judgment call to be taken by the relevant authorities, and on this occasion the judgment that they made was that this was acceptable. For me, and for a small majority of callers today, the line should be drawn below there. It should be off limits, the private home of an elected official or any public figure. But, I told you it wasn't simple. It is 1 minute after 11. I think we found some £125 for a dozen in Knightsbridge, but that's Knightsbridge. You go to Knightsbridge, you know that you're going to get rinsed. It's a premium. It's a postcode premium, isn't it? How much does that work out each? £125 for 12. It's £10. It's more than what I was. Mine was £7.50 each. So £125 for 12. Are they the most expensive roses in London? I do not know. Speaking of numbers, so I don't know if you heard that bit in the bulletins about attacks on shop workers. The figure, I confess to you, I was going to talk about this on the radio, and then I thought, the figures aren't high enough, because I heard the figure 1,300 in the bulletin. You may or may not have noticed over the years or months or possibly minutes that we have spent together in your lifetime. You may have noticed that I'm not always as clued up as you might expect me to be before I dive into a topic. I'm usually pretty good, but occasionally I've been a little bit slapdash in the morning. So I cut this story out of the paper, but it has a percentage on it. It says violence and abuse against retail workers up by 50%. And I have sometimes fallen into the trap when deciding upon topics to discuss with you based on headlines. I've sometimes fallen into the percentage trap. Not quite as violently as Laura Trott fell into the percentage trap when being interviewed on the BBC last week and revealing that there's a very strong case to be made that she doesn't actually know what percentages are, or GDP, or debt, for that matter, as a percentage of GDP. But if I come on air and say they've gone up by 100%, then quite often the first call I'll get will say, yeah, there were 3 last year and there's 6 this year, James. It's hardly what you'd call a cause for national celebration or national condemnation. So I just thought, when I heard that figure of 1,300 in the news, I thought, that's 1,300 attacks of 1,300 incidents of violence and abuse towards shop staff. And I thought to myself, because I'm an idiot, I thought to myself, 1,300 attacks a year? What's everyone getting so upset about? And then, of course, I did what you would do in the circumstances I've just described. You'd think, hang on a minute, if everyone's getting so upset about it, it's probably me that's made a mistake here rather than them. So you return to the copy, you return to the story, and you realise that it's 1,300 incidents a day. Violence and abuse against shop workers rose to 1,300 incidents a day last year, according to the British Retail Consortium. That's a rise of about 50% in the year to September 2023. Per day. I'm going to say that a few times now because it needs driving home. If not for you, then certainly for me. Every day. That's per day. That is a daily. 1,300 incidents of violence and abuse towards retail workers every day. And looking at this story, it occurred to me that we spend quite a lot of time describing the decline in the enjoyment levels in various public sector jobs. In fact, I think this very week we've talked about why the NHS is an increasingly less attractive employment option, particularly for British people, which is why we have to beg, borrow and steal staff from around the world who we discovered from the quality of calls that we took that day often come here and quickly get just as disillusioned with the state of the NHS and the relationship between what they get paid and what they have to pay to stay afloat as the people who were born here in the first place. So we do it with the NHS, we've done it with the police, we've done it with all sorts of public sector workers. Often when industrial action is underway, we discover that teachers, for example, and certainly junior doctors are taking the action that they're taking at least as much to protect the future of their profession from this constant erosion and diminishment as they are to improve their own short-term remunerations and terms and conditions. But we don't do it with the private sector very much. Now, it may surprise you to learn, if you are new to the programme, I love retail. If I hadn't got into journalism when I did, I think I would have stayed in retail. I don't know what I would have done because I was quite pushy, stroke ambitious. So I may have ended up opening my own place or trying to climb up the greasy ladder of executive. I don't think I would have stayed on the shop floor forever. But I love retail. My mum had a shop. My mum had a little frock shop on Cumberton Hill in Kidderminster, for those of you who are familiar with that locale. I cut my teeth on the perfume counter in Beatty's in Worcester. I didn't literally cut my teeth on the perfume counter, although they are made of glass. I was working for Dupe and Davidoff Cool Water, and I loved it. And then it was menswear. Then I went to work for River Island, also in Worcester, and latterly I worked for Aquascutum on Regent Street, long beyond the expected shelf life of my holiday job or my student job. I carried on doing it while Fleet Street and the world of British media remained peculiarly immune to my legion charms, and it was reaching the point where I was thinking, well, it's never going to happen. I'm never going to be a journalist. And it wasn't like some big heartbreak for me. I thought, right, I'm going to try and get a promotion here. I want to become an area manager. I love shops. I used to, but this is an old man speaking. Well, not that old, but this is someone doing that thing I say we have to be very careful not to do on the programme, whether we're talking about house prices or whether we are talking about trigger warnings. The world changes. The world today for a 25-year-old is not the same as it was 27 years ago when I was a 25-year-old. So it occurs to me that I probably have a slightly dewy-eyed notion, a slightly rose-tinted idea of what it's like to work in retail. I mean, I had some vaguely unpleasant experiences, but nothing that could realistically be described as violence or abuse. Elle Macpherson's boyfriend was once incredibly rude to me, but that was more than made up for by the way that she caught my eye from behind his back and mouthed the word sorry at Elle Macpherson, known at the time as the Body. Reputedly one of the most beautiful women on the planet, mouthing a silent sorry to me because her boyfriend was being rather stupid. I think it was one of those occasions where, no, I can't remember. I used to have this appalling habit when I worked in, people presume that you're not as well educated as they are sometimes when you're working in a shop. So the only bad experiences I had, people would sometimes start talking French to each other because they'd think I couldn't understand. And I'd just join in the conversation in French, because often they didn't even have very good French. They weren't French people. They sort of had O-level French, and they thought that because I worked in a shop, I wouldn't have O-level French. So they'd say, something in French, and I would then leave it for a couple of exchanges. They never said something like, this bloke is a right old pain in the butt, isn't he? I don't know if I could translate that into French. I don't know the word for butt. But there was never that. They were just talking about the suit or claim, perhaps arguing that it was too expensive or c'est trop cher. I said, oui, c'est un peu cher, mais c'est très, très bon. And I'd join in, and that would raise eyebrows. You'd never really make a sale if you did that because you've embarrassed the customer, which is something you should never do. And there was an occasion, which I don't think I can tell you about. Here is a question for the people who have paid more attention to this programme over the last 20 years than I have. All right? Have I ever told you the story about the lady, as in a peerage, who brought in her son's pyjamas for a refund? Have I ever told you that story? Because if I haven't told you that story, I don't think I can, because it's gross. But if I have told you that story, then if you're very, very good, I may return to that territory a little later this hour. That was probably my grimmest experience as a shop worker, and it was about as grim as it is possible to imagine. But violence and abuse, no, that never happened to me. So the question becomes, what's it like to work in a shop these days? And I know that sounds vague, but it's with particular reference to violence and abuse. It must be linked to the spike in shoplifting, mustn't it? Because if you try and stop someone from shoplifting, and let's be honest, no one else is going to, you try and stop somebody from shoplifting, they are likely to be either violent or abusive or both towards you. So I'm particularly interested, of course it's derrière, le derrière. C'est homme est un... What's pain then? Pain in the derrière. And listen, don't stop sending me French words for bottom. Imagine if someone came in and looked over my shoulder at my screen, they'd think you were weird, and I don't want them thinking you're weird. But I want to know what it's like. You've been doing it for quite a long time, perhaps. It must have changed beyond all recognition now. You must get so frustrated with people coming in who are clearly just scoping the shop before doing all their shopping online. That would drive you nuts, especially if you were on commission. I was on commission. It wasn't a big commission, but we had a coat. It was made of vicuna. Vicuna is like a little llama that was endangered for a while, but there was I think it was an Argentinian company that brought it back from the brink of extinction and started selling coats made out of it. We were knocking those out, those coats, in the early 1990s, right? Early to mid 1990s. Guess how much we were knocking out vicuna overcoats for? Go on, have a guess. I'm not doing the same thing that I did with the roses. £15,000. £15,000 vicuna overcoats. I sold one to Ronnie Wood out of the Rolling Stones. In fact, he was such I mean, they were amazing coats, but they only came in one colour. They only came in camel, you know, that camel-y colour. And he asked if we could dye one blue for him. So I went upstairs to talk to the manager, and he said, there's no earthly way we're putting a £15,000 overcoat through a sort of experimental dyeing process, even if he is a Rolling Stone. But even if you're on 0.5%, £15,000, Anyway, I digress. You're right, Mike, to imagine Are You Being Served? My experience of retail was very like Grace Brothers. There were even a couple of characters on the shop floor who bore comparison with some of the stars of Are You Being Served? But all of that is merely to establish that I do know what I'm talking about, or I used to know what I'm talking about in the context of retail, but I don't know now. So at 11:15, the question for this hour is pretty straightforward. Have you ever been a victim of violence or abuse while working in a shop? And why do you think it has got so much worse? Why do you think it has deteriorated in such a horrible way? Onkar knows what I'm talking about. They say, I absolutely love my business. We've had it in our family for 40 years. And the hardest part now is when people steal and then become abusive, stroke aggressive, stroke violent. You're not trained to deal with this when you're a shopkeeper. I remember the manager in River Island, I've told you this before, sending me to chase someone he thought was a shopkeeper. So I'm chasing him up the road, and he's carrying a briefcase. He was a sort of professional shoplifter. He wore a suit and a tie because you're less suspicious of people like that. In fact, there's a story in the newspapers today about a sacked Sainsbury's employee who went back to steal from the shop, from a branch of Sainsbury's in her uniform. Criminal mastermind, criminal genius. So I'm chasing this bloke. Imagine if your dog ever caught a bus. Does your dog chase buses or squirrels? Does your dog chase squirrels? What would your dog do if it caught a squirrel? What the hell would I have done if I'd caught this shoplifter? He stopped in the middle of Worcester High Street and went, come on then. I haven't got anything. And he opened his briefcase and showed me. But what if he was? What if it was full of Levi's 501s? What am I going to do? Put him in a half Nelson? Start boxing him? It'd be like Hugh Grant and Colin Firth at the end of Bridget Jones. I'd be going all like this, all Queensberry rules. And he'd probably lamp me over the head with a spanner or a briefcase or so. So what the hell was I doing chasing that person up the street? So there you go. That's some sympathy, some experience of it. So what's it like to be a victim of violence and abuse when you're working in a shop? Not in A&E, not for the police, not as a bouncer. You're working in a shop. 0345 6060 973. And genuine question. I don't want to do the decline of Western society on the programme every day. But why? Why has it got so much worse? I mean, going up by 50% in a single year is not a question about the incremental slow decline of decorum and society. That's about something that's happened specifically in the last 18 months. What is it? What has happened in the last 18 months that has turned shop fronts, shop floors into war zones? I want proper answers to that. 0345 6060 973. And I know what you're thinking. You think, I hope he's got some more retail-based anecdotes to share in the course of this hour, to which my response is, well, you'd never know your luck. Someone wrote me a lovely poem. Isn't that nice? When's the last time anyone wrote you a poem, eh? Hang on, I should read it to you, shouldn't I, before waxing lyrical? It's a lovely poem. It's based upon a well-established trope. It is, not an entirely original idea. I'm just filling time now as I scroll through Twitter trying to find the poem. But I think I can remember the poem off by heart, but then I wouldn't be giving credit to the actual poet. And you should always, here you go, it's from a Twitter account, it's from Adam, actually, whose Twitter account is rather splendidly named. Are you ready for this? Do you like a poem, Keith? Do you like poems? The boy stood on the burning deck, picking his nose like mad. He rolled them into little balls and flicked them at his dad, that kind of thing, yeah? Ready for this? Roses are red. If you're just tuning in, I was marvelling earlier at being asked to pay £75 for 10 red roses at a flower stall in London yesterday. I didn't pay it. I began to Morrison's. Roses are red, violets are blue, flowers are prohibitively expensive. I've blown it. But put my teeth in and try again. Ready? Roses are red, violets are blue, flowers are prohibitively expensive since we left the EU. Boom. Love it. And I've got something that may be relevant to that. Why is the phrase Brexit means Brexit in the news today? I may give you a multiple choice on this later, but I know what you're thinking. I thought this was a phone-in show. And do you know what? You're right. Brett's in Northampton to talk about retail. Brett, what made you pick up the phone?
I've been waiting for you to discuss it. I saw the headline this morning. I was desperate. I thought if anybody's going to speak about this today, it's going to be James O'Brien with his storied past in retail as well.
And it's Valentine's Day as well. What a lovely bromance we're having. Perfect.
Well, you have kept me sane since about 2015, and also my tale, for want of a better expression, has a definitive link to Brexit as well, because I felt that people's attitudes towards retail staff changed significantly in the build-up and immediately post the referendum vote. It was almost as though there was an acceptance that you could just be horrible.
I think I would agree that in many areas of life it seemed to license obnoxiousness for people who suddenly found themselves having their obnoxiousness indulged, whereas for previous years they'd been kept in a box by political correctness or whatever you wanted to call it. I think that licensing of obnoxiousnness might be part of what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So I, like you as well, I fell into retail, and I hate this term, but I was probably educated past the general level.
Yeah.
But I worked in the mobile phone industry as a sort of student job at the beginning of my university life, and found out that rewards for working within that industry at that time far outstripped my chosen sort of academic route.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I loved it. I loved working with the team. I loved working with the public. And I would say we had a threat of violence. I'm a mixed race male as well.
Yeah.
So the threats of violence, threats of racism, you maybe got one a month, one every 2 months or so.
Okay.
In the immediate period before and post referendum, that went up to one a day. And
Seriously?
These were threats of death. So, and the tipping point for me that forced me out of retail, a career that I'll always love.
Yeah, same.
Where I was threatened a customer, in very inverted commas, threatened to stab me. He was going to go home, get a kitchen knife, come back. Sorry for the trigger warning for those people. Threatened to go home, get a knife, come back and stab me. I had his business details on the side of his van, his registration number. Had him on audio and visual CCTV, called the police, as I found I was doing almost daily.
Yeah.
They just looked weary with the constant reports from retail staff. We were in quite an isolated spot as well on a sort of destination site.
Yeah.
The retailers amongst us will know what that means. That incident was, I've got 2 small children, and I genuinely believe this gentleman was going to come back. I use gentleman in very inverted commas.
No,
as well.
I hear you, and that was, I mean, a culmination really of a creeping climb towards this kind of behaviour becoming commonplace. It's extraordinary, isn't it, to think that just well, forgive me for asking this question, Brett, because it might not be appropriate, but what was his grievance? So if he was just trying to get himself a mobile phone, I don't understand how that level of anger could be reached.
Well, firstly, I think you need to appreciate, and I know that you were in the sartorial field, but you need to appreciate just how emotional people get about their mobile devices.
Yes.
However, most people who work in retail stores, and we know that you are buying on behalf of a third party. So more often than not, when something goes wrong, it isn't really the retailer's responsibility to fix that. It goes to the manufacturer.
Yes.
We can't do anything about it. And I never went into a retail negotiation with the view of being obstreperous with a customer at any point. It's much easier for us to just get it fixed, get it done, send them on their way happy, because we're scored on every single interaction we have, which then impacts on our earning ability. So we do whatever we can to make sure that.
So you're algorithmed into submission, but if something goes wrong with a phone, Chummo there is going to hold you personally responsible for it and thinks that he's more likely to get a response if he threatens you, despite the fact that's highly unlikely to escalate, isn't it? If you go, oh yeah, all right, you've threatened to stab me, I'll give you a new phone now because you've threatened to stab me. You got me there. Well played. Great tactics.
Exactly. But what was more galling was I received a phone call. That was the last straw. I left. I received a phone call 6 months after the fact from my local police station to say that they wouldn't be proceeding with the case because there wasn't sufficient evidence to charge. And that's, you know, you feel as though you feel as though you have no protection whatsoever. So
that's really interesting. That's because let me read you this from Michael, who's in Enfield. He's going back a while. You can tell that because he used to work for Rumbelows. And he says, someone once stole a pocket radio from the shop. I ran down the high street after them. I brought them right back to the shop and made them put it back on the shelf. I was only 16 at the time. I was on a YTS scheme, and I wouldn't do that now. And that's what you mean by realising that there's not a sort of safety, a social safety net or a society backup in those sort of circumstances. You're on your own. You were on your own.
Yeah. But you're also slightly isolated by the retailer as well, because if that customer decides to make a complaint because you have in some way defended yourself, the business will always find against you as well, because it's deemed to be not delivering that level of service that's required. You know, when I have responded to somebody calling me the M word, which just became a daily thing, and me ejecting somebody from the store, I've had to then field complaints from that person for being ejected, despite the fact that I have them on audio and visual CCTV, racially abusing me. And it becoming a police matter, but still a business would censor me for not adopting a more customer-centric approach.
That's the old customer is always right approach, even when they're racially abusing one of our members of staff. I don't think that's grim stuff, Brett. Thank you. I don't think it was going to comfort you much to know that Rishi Sunak gave an interview last week in which he claimed that those sort of epithets and insults don't happen anymore, including the P word. I don't know if he referenced the N word, but Rishi Sunak lives in a world where that never happens, which is very nice for him. It's coming up to 11:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Brett's experience cuts straight to the heart of this story, really, about incidents against staff being up 50% in the year to September 2023. We want to know what they were like in the year to September 2013, really, don't we? Because a 50% rise in a single year seems shocking. But if Brett's evidence is even close to widespread, close to commonplace, you've gone from monthly to daily, which is an increase of much more than 50%. Don't ask me to work out what it's an increase of. I was struggling with 125 divided by 12 a minute ago. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It's 33 after 11. I saw something the other day, actually, just outside Marks and Spencer's. Would you believe? Things must be bad if it's happening in Marks and Spencer's. I wasn't in the shop. I was walking past. I sometimes stop and have a chat with Lawrence, who sells the Big Issue outside one of my local branches, and he will be listening now, so I love to think of him out in the cold and the wet, getting a little mention on that. He'd much rather I bought a copy of the magazine, of course, which I promised to do next time I see you, but it was outside, it was on his patch. I don't think he was there, but a sort of, a West London mum was shouting incomprehensible in her anger because she had caught a shoplifter. So she had pointed out to staff that a shoplifter was just walking out of the shop with loads of stolen food. And it was her. Because I was not shocked because of the conversations we've had on the radio, but she couldn't believe that there was no point of recourse. We had quite a big problem in my neck of the woods with drug addicts shoplifting and acting with almost impunity. In fact, it made the national news. Once again, testament to my skills as a journalist. I had no idea. In fact, the shopkeeper that gave an interview to the Daily Mail, it's a shop I go into quite often, and I never even clocked it. Let's talk about having a story under your nose and completely missing it. But the little stretch of shops was being terrorised by shoplifting drug addicts. And one of the reasons it goes on, one of the reasons they got away with it, of course, is because who is going to stop them? Who is going to put... I mean, forgive me, I've got nothing but respect for security guards, but you're not likely to be paid enough money to put your life on the line to protect prawn sandwiches. It's not like you're a soldier or a police officer. But this mum, this I don't know if she was a mum, but this woman of roughly my age couldn't actually quite believe... What are you going to do? You can't just let him walk away. Look! And yet... what would you do? And part of the reason why you do nothing is because if you do something, you become one of the 1,300 incidents a day of violence and abuse being directed at shop workers. But I'm particularly interested in the more like the stuff that Brett described, where you're not trying to catch crooks. You're literally just doing your job. And the great British public has in recent years become, well, that license to obnoxious, that license to be obnoxious seems to have been issued to an awful lot of people. So you work in a shop, you have done for years. What's it like to be on the receiving end of violence or abuse from someone who's not a crook or a criminal? Just do you see what I mean? Like an escalation of a normal customer to a point where you can't quite believe what you're expected to endure. So look, trying to stop a shoplifter and getting spat at is disgusting, but it's dog bites man territory, right? It's expected and expectable, if that's a word. But trying to sell someone a nice pair of trousers and getting spat at, that's man bites dog territory. That is not something you would expect to happen. So what's that like? And crucially, why do you think it's happening? Particularly at this breakneck speed of the last couple of years. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Anne in Edinburgh writes, please tell us about the pyjamas and the Baroness, James. Ozzy and I are dying to know. Have you written Ozzy and I are dying to know, or you are an Aussie and you are dying to know, Anne? I don't know. I may tell you the story. I'll check with Keith on whether or not he thinks it's suitable for your delicate ears. But I'm telling you now, someone got quite close. They said, was this aristocrat that brought her son's pyjamas back to your shop for a refund, was she the Baroness of Skidderminster by any chance? Close, but no. Henry's in Stratford. Henry, what would you like to say?
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call, James.
You're very welcome, Henry.
This is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I've worked in security for several years, and it's a regular occurrence to see potentially people who are affected by the habit of drugs, alcohol, or just stealing for the want to have something. Consistently, I've seen people who are, or who they say are affected by the cost of living crisis, where they are stealing food, baby formula, whatever it may be, supplies to get them by. When I was doing security in a well-known sports retailer, I won't mention the name, but they regularly had people attempting to steal football jerseys, footballs, you name it, they try and take it, presumably to resell.
I mean, I don't want to sound ungrateful. I'm familiar with that, and we've tracked the exponential rise in it. How long have you been doing the job, give or take?
4 years.
Only 4. So you've never really known it any different, or have things got worse in the course of those 4 years?
I'd say coming into COVID and the lockdowns, after COVID, you can understand why. However, going into it, because people were such in a stressful situation where there was less of what we needed or what we wanted, and so the frustration was taken out on the shopkeepers, the store staff,
That's
and
really
the security.
interesting. So it's almost as if we became de-civilized during lockdown.
In a sense, yes.
Because I got a message, oddly, while you were talking from somebody who has their own shop. They say, we've barred more customers for abusive behaviour last year than we had in the previous 10 years combined. People get very weird about clothes. They certainly do.
I couldn't
but they
tell
write...
you how many people I've tried to bar from stores I've worked for, James.
Are you allowed to?
Yes. Work with the management within the stores.
But that's for shoplifting, isn't it? I mean, I'm sounding like a right pain in the bum, Henry. I do apologise, but that's kind of the dog bites man territory, the theft, which we know it's that. So this text is from someone who works in a smart part of Cheshire, in the kind of retail environment where you really wouldn't expect to be barring customers. So it's more that obnoxious normal customer, the way people speak to you, even if you haven't just caught them nicking a leg of lamb. Has that changed in 4 years?
Worse. Yeah. Increasingly worse. I can say to you quite honestly, it is the younger generations, I'd say from 15 years of age to, let's say, 28 years of age, that are the worst. The constant swearing, abuse, comments about race, height, weight, talking about someone's sexuality, gender, and the concern is that because there's not enough police, the police don't respond to calls.
And that means the next time they do it, they'll go a little bit further. And it is people like you who are very much on the front line. I always try to find a quote from Thucydides at this point, but I can never find it. It's from about 500 years BC when he's talking about the younger generation. So we always, and I'm guilty as well, Henry, we always have to take it with a little pinch of salt, that they're much worse now than they were in my day. In my dayitis, I think we called it, didn't we, earlier this year, but or late last year. But there is something there, the idea of something having changed. You know what my big thing is? People who got their phones on public transport without wearing headphones, whether they're listening to music, watching TV, or having a conversation. I accept the inconvenience of having to listen to your end of a conversation if you're blessed with quite a loud voice and you're having a conversation on public transport. But in recent months, it's the other end of the conversation that I'm getting as well. It's extraordinary. Henry, thank you. I have got a game for you. So I mentioned the phrase Brexit means Brexit. Why is it in the news today? I've got 3 reasons, okay? Is Brexit means Brexit in the news? Because A, Marc Francois has announced the imminent release of the 2nd volume of his memoirs, and Brexit means Brexit is the title. Is it B, because the younger generation that Henry just referred to routinely shouts Brexit means Brexit on the football pitch before going in with a tackle that has no intention whatsoever of getting the ball and is designed solely to hobble the opponent? Or is it C, Craig Andrews, 31, from Dundee, is having laser removal of his Brexit means Brexit tattoo after getting sacked, or rather losing his job, because the company he worked for has gone under as a direct consequence of Brexit. So why is Brexit means Brexit in the news today? Is it A, because it's the title of the 2nd volume of Marc Francois's memoirs? Is it B, because it's what children now shout up and down the country when they're going in 2-footed in a football tackle designed to hurt the opponent and not get anywhere near the ball? Or is it C, because a 31-year-old man in Dundee is having his Brexit means Brexit tattoo removed by laser after losing his job as a consequence of Brexit? A, B or C? Text me your answer to 84850. I'll tell you the answer before home time today, if I remember. Grant's in Kettering. Grant, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Nice to speak to you again, mate.
A, B or C? A, B or C?
I'm going to go, I think it's a combination of A and C myself.
Interesting. You're not allowed...
From what I just caught.
You're not allowed combinations, but I'll take it on board. Go on, what do you want to say? What did you ring in for?
So, I've worked in retail most of my life. Like a lot of people that work in retail, I've fallen into it.
Yes.
It's just kind of something I did during college, like you mentioned previously, and like one of your callers mentioned previously.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily say it's from Brexit myself or from the referendum. For me, I've seen an uptake in abuse on staff, definitely coming out of the lockdowns.
Yeah.
People seem a lot more entitled. They seem to look down on shop workers and hospitality as well.
Yeah.
Those of us that work in those industries as lesser than them. That we work in these places because we're not very intellectual.
Right.
And that, we're not serving society in a way that's deemed responsible or making a difference. And that's just the impression that I've got from a lot of people. I was just saying to your research, it was only the other day I was having a woman having a right go at me in my store. and it started getting personal.
Right. Why? Can we back up a bit? What was the point of contention?
We couldn't supply something that we tried to get hold of. We let them know that we couldn't do it in the end.
So a perfectly normal and innocuous scenario, you would think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And another customer had to intervene because it was getting to the point where this woman, like I say, she was becoming personally abusive towards me, and I can take a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But soon as anyone starts abusing my staff or myself,
yeah,
I step up a bit, and I try and evacuate or eject them from the store. But you can't put your hands on people to move them out.
No,
Police won't do anything. If you're part of a security network, they only do a certain amount because they're tied by laws. Yes. And again, if they touch people, they are done. I mean, I've had people throw things at me, try and attack me. Can
I ask what branch? You don't have to tell me, but what sort of retail are you in? What are you selling? Can I ask?
It's clothing. We deal with clothing. It's men's fashion.
I thought you were going to say something like she needed a big end for her car, or she wouldn't be able to get home without the thing that you'd not been able to. So it was just an item of clothing that you hadn't been able to order in, and she starts effing and jeffing at you. Yeah, how personal did she get? How personal did she get?
Very. She started telling me I was diseased, started mocking me for the outfit I was wearing, my appearance. And you just laugh it off because it's just these things that you get.
You do and you don't. You do and you don't. I know.
Yeah, I get what you mean, but for me, it's just water off a duck's back. Do you know what I mean?
I do know
we shouldn't have to take it.
It doesn't have to be, and it won't be for everybody. I'll ask you a question quite diplomatically, if I may. Was she normal to start with, or
no?
Right.
No.
So she came in. She was trouble from the start.
It was the third time she'd been into my particular store. We had the conversation the second time about trying to get hold of it and not being able to.
Yeah.
The third time she came in to actually try and trick us to see if we were then still supplying this or not.
Because she thought you were lying to her about not being able to get hold of something.
Possibly. And this isn't someone you would expect it from. This woman, she was of pension age, I would suggest.
Well, that's what I meant by normal. That's what I meant. She didn't come in stinking of methylated spirits with her trousers around her ankles or anything like that. No. That's what I meant. She appeared respectable. I don't want to sound snobbish.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, you wouldn't expect this if you saw someone like that walking down the street.
Good Lord.
Being that kind of thing, yeah. But it's not going to get better because the police just don't do anything, and when you hear about it in the news where the thefts and the police forces don't really do much when shops report thefts these days. Yeah. I know a lot of businesses that don't even bother reporting it. Most businesses these days will count it in theft.
Yeah, and what are you going to do then? Well, next time you're confronted with someone who's in the middle of filling their boots, you'd almost be foolish to get involved, given that you're not going to get support or backup from anywhere, although you're probably going to get into trouble for your shrinkage rates. Grant, take care, mate. I know it's water off a duck's back, but equally, you don't deserve that, and you're allowed to be upset by it. You don't have to put all your effort into convincing yourself that you're not, because everybody hurts, as REM so famously observed. Thank you. Up next, I don't know if you remember, did Henry go to it for us? To that, it's so hard to keep up with these fringe, hard right factions building up in the Tory. Of course he went to it, because that's when we went through the list of all the fringe hard right factions springing up in the Tory party. There's the EBB and the JCV, in out, the shake it all about party, the in out party, the out party, your left leg in, your right leg out, all of that party, all of these different factions. But the newest one was the one that Lewis Goodall went to when Jacob Rees-Mogg was very, very rude to him after Lewis pointed out his epic hypocrisy. And they were called the Popcorns, weren't they? The Popcorns. Well, my friend and inspiration in many ways, Peter Gagan, the investigative journalist at Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, also, he's far too modest to remind you, the purveyor of a rather splendid Substack to which you can subscribe, has been looking at the funding behind this latest new grouping of hard-right agitators. And the last time Peter was in the studio, I don't think he's in the studio this time, but the last time he was in the studio, it prompted was it a 2-year investigation by Ofcom into allegations from the Institute of Economic Affairs that we had misrepresented them. No prizes for guessing who won. I'll give you a clue. It was me and Peter. It is 11:53. Alison writes, "Hi James, I was attacked working in a garden centre for not reducing a white orchid in price because the man really wanted a pink one. My industry, filmmaking, shut down in lockdown, so I took a charity job," writes Chris, "delivering medication for the NHS. The nicest, most polite people lived on council estates in some terrible houses. The rudest people were male, between 40 and 60, living in posh houses who it's a bit close to home, Chris. I hope you didn't deliver anything to my gaff. Living in posh houses who treated me, and I assume all delivery drivers, with disdain. So I now make a point of being ultra nice to every delivery driver." And this finally unsigned hate speech has been normalised by far-right politicians. The failure of Brexit is blamed on minorities as they are unable to defend themselves. UK society has devolved over the last 10 years. There is no hope in Britain anymore due to the Conservatives who have bled the economy dry. All today's issues are connected. I think they are. I do my best to connect them in How They Broke Britain, my current bestseller. But I can tell you for a fact that one of the people whose work I drew on while writing that book is Peter Gagan, the investigative journalist now plying his trade at the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and the author of Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. Democracy for Sale is also the title of his Substack, to which I encourage you to subscribe. So when I read or heard, Peter, that there was a new right-wing grouping being launched with Liz Truss up on the stage, I found myself thinking, I wonder where the money's come from. And then I found myself thinking, I bet I know a man who knows.
Well, it's funny you should ask, James, because it's the same question I asked myself. There was something about seeing Liz Truss back on a stage promising to restore democratic accountability to Britain that made me go, well, I wonder where the accounts and the accountability for the popular Conservatives are. And that's exactly the first place I went to have a look as well. Liz
Truss, we should remind ourselves, was greeted upon her elevation to Downing Street as essentially by one Conservative commentator as having turned Downing Street into an incubator for the Institute of what's it called? Economic Affairs, our old friends over there, and they were very happy with the suggestion that she was very much a creature of their mysteriously funded ideology. So that's why our twin antennae started twitching.
Yeah, very much. And what you can see from this, it's interesting because in Britain, as we've discussed on this programme before, it's very easy to influence politics anonymously. And one of the ways you can influence politics anonymously is give money to think tanks. Also, thanks to new changes to electoral law, you can give more and more amounts of money anonymously to political parties. But one thing you have to do if you're going to run anything political, if you publish material, election material or political material, you have to say who's published it. So one of the few little interesting things that I noticed from the PopCon's launch was there was little leaflets going around setting out their agenda, saying who they are, and they said that they were funded by, these leaflets were produced by a company called, with this snazzy title, Popular Development Partners Limited. But this is, basically, it sounds like a housing developer. Well, actually, turns out it's not.
Sounds like a dating site, actually.
Yes, find your popular partner. Actually, it's a company that's set up back in October by Mark Littlewood, who was the former chief executive of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And when I looked a little bit deeper, it looked as if the other person who'd also set up the company with him was his wife, Angela Abbot, who also used to work for the IEA. The IEA have said they're nothing to do with PopCons itself, and they're not involved in the project at all.
There's still some mystery surrounding Littlewood's departure from the IEA, only in the sense that it's not been fully explained, and it was widely unexpected in the kind of circles that these operations mix in.
And he's now emerged as the director of the PopCons, which is an interesting new job for him. And he was on the stage talking about the PopCons. We know the history of the IEA has been to take money from, this is documented from people like BP, from Big Tobacco, from others. And fundamentally, it begs the question, who's funding the PopCons? And so I started looking a bit more at that too, and where are some of the people who've been funding Liz Truss? And it's quite interesting. Jeremy Hoskin, who funds the Reclaim Party, Lawrence Fox's not particularly successive election vehicle.
Right, not particularly successful yet, Peter. Let's not count any electoral chickens.
There's deposits lost in the London mayoral election Uxbridge suggest that maybe there's great things yet to come.
And again, in his defence, the amount of money lost on deposits is as nothing compared to the amount of money lost in the libel courts. So all things are relative.
Very true. Liz Truss has been very close to the kind of think tank world in the United States. The Heritage Foundation they both flew her out to America to give a talk, and they flew her to Switzerland as well. The Heritage Foundation, for listeners who aren't aware of them, are a very, very hard right think tank based in the States. They are currently developing what they're calling Project 2025, which is for Donald Trump, the first day on office, basically to dismantle the administrative state of the United States. So they are some of the people that are in the ecosystem of this. Of course, we've got GB News as well. GB News has been pushing a lot of this, but also the Legatum Institute, who are one of the owners of GB News, they contributed £50,000 to one of these groups, the New Conservatives, many of whom were also at the PopCons. We've seen some of this opinion polling recently. Some people might have seen it in the Telegraph. Huge, big surveys, very, very damaging to Rishi Sunak, suggesting he needs to go harder to the right. Who funds this? It suggests it probably costs around £70,000 to do this. We don't know who's funded it. Lord David Frost.
Yeah, we know that David Frost, the man who was responsible for Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, which he then sought to disown before the ink had dried, he's been put up as the man you go to. But it's obviously not his money that has been spent upon the polling. And just to stress, Liz Truss was talking about accountability when she took to the stage at their conference, at their launch.
Well, this is the big aspect with this, James. And what the PopCons, I think, show is just how easy it is to get a huge amount of publicity, because it's not surprising. Liz Truss, I think a lot of people there's almost a freak show element. Liz Truss is seriously going back into the public domain. She's seriously going to suggest that she should be the figurehead for a new movement. So you can understand some of that. But you have to understand how incredibly adept these organizations are with small amounts of money at getting huge amounts of traction. The IEA, they say they're not behind the PopCons, but we do know that they received more than 5,000 media hits in the last year, according to their own company accounts. That's a huge amount of media traction. We know from senior IEA people, not Mark Littlewood, it looks as if his peerage was knocked back, but other senior IEA people have been put in the House of Lords by Liz Truss and by others. And there's a huge, we can see policy. Now, I'm currently working on stories around looking at the policies that some of these groups have put forward and how they've just got into government so easy, and how they've turned from policy proposals funded by we don't know who into government policy, often in a matter of months.
And anyone who's not aware of why this is also alarming probably will be by now. But how can people follow your work more closely, Peter? Because there aren't many doing it, are there? Rather shamefully and sadly. Although I suppose it gives you a very nice niche. But I mean, I'm sure you'd rather be less lonely in this particular furrow. How can people follow your work more closely?
Thank you very much, James. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Substack. Is the main place you'll find all these stories. The Democracy for Sale Substacks. If you just go on there, you'll get my regular newsletter. It goes out about once a week, and I am covering a lot of these areas. I, like you, would like more people to cover it too. You know, nobody wants to be the only person. No, indeed. Peter Geoghegan, many thanks indeed. Just and I'll spell his surname for you so you can find all of that more easily. Geoghan. I shall retweet something from my account shortly. So if you follow me, there'll be links there to what you need. Just these are the important questions. Who is controlling the news agenda? You know, it's not the Jewish oligarchs that Boris Johnson accused in his novel, or Jewish interests, as that Labour candidate who's now been rightly dispensed with, who claims it. It is very, very rich people giving money to organisations without telling you where the money's come from. It's extraordinary. But as Peter pointed out, the numbers of those of us who care about it and appreciate the importance are growing, but nowhere near fast enough. You want them to grow as fast as the economy fell when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. 5 minutes after 12, quite a bit of a late flurry there on calls regarding retail. So I may take a couple more of those this hour, but we're going to mix things up a bit. Let me remind you, quite a few of you pointed out, this is how the Mystery Hour board game works. Mystery Hour will be with us, of course, tomorrow from 12, and there's actually a by-elections tomorrow, so that is why Mystery Hour was invented. But the way it works, if you play the board game, is there's a question, and then there are three possible answers to it. And the game, gives you a right answer and a wrong answer, and then if you're very good at it, you make up your own wrong answer. And you get extra points if people guess that as the right answer. I made up one of the answers to the question... Actually, I made up two of the answers to the question about why Brexit means Brexit is in the news. And I am delighted to tell you that one of my made-up answers has come first by a country mile, including Keith. Keith voted for my wrong answer, for one of my wrong answers. So to remind you, the choices were, why is Brexit means Brexit in the news today? The answers are, is it A,
because Marc Francois, remember him, has announced the title of his second volume of memoirs? Is it B, because school children up and down the land now shout Brexit means Brexit before going in two-footed on an ankle-breaking tackle that is designed solely to injure their opponent without going anywhere near the ball? Or is it C, because a 31-year-old man from Dundee called Craig Andrews has deployed laser surgery to have his Brexit means Brexit tattoo removed after losing his job as a consequence of Brexit? And guess what everybody went for? Yeah, everybody went for C. You're so silly, because it's just the detail, you see. It's because I said Craig Andrews 31. You thought, oh, well, that must be it. He's reading that out of the paper. Made it up. In fact, I made it up. It was in Great Yarmouth originally, but I don't think I said that bit out loud. I went for Dundee for some reason. Great Yarmouth would have been even better. Something about Great Yarmouth would have sounded even more plausible for someone having a Brexit means Brexit tattoo, which they subsequently had to get removed as a consequence of losing their job because of Brexit. Great Yarmouth would have gone but even further. A few of you said it's B. It's B, but I wish it was C. And if you had said B, then you would be correct. It is not only reported today in one newspaper, but also in the Urban Dictionary that Brexit means Brexit is what is shouted when somebody hits a massive slide tackle and usually sends their opponent flying and hurts them severely. So it is literally now, this is Nigel Farage's legacy to the country. It is what children shout when they're inflicting acts of violence on each other. Brexit means Brexit. Recognising the absolute idiocy and the intellectual vacuity of the phrase that Theresa May introduced into public parlance. Meaningless phrase. She gets quite an easy ride, Theresa May, and she kind of deserves it compared to what came after. But my goodness me, Brexit means Brexit was a low point in our national decline, wasn't it? Or an important point in a national decline. 8 minutes after 12 is the time. Right. Another weird one now for you. Michael Gove. I've read this story twice, and I've read it in newspapers that I don't normally like. For example, the Daily Mail. To be absolutely clear that I have understood it properly. We're very lucky on property conversations on this programme. There is there's a rich vein of people listening to this programme who really understand property and, crucially, planning, which is just as well, really, because I haven't got a Scooby-Doo. I couldn't believe it when we built an extension on our last house that there was stuff you could do without planning permission. Do you know what I mean? Permitted development. So up to a point, if you're doing a bit of a extension downstairs or you're doing the loft, extending the loft so you can live in it, there's a permitted development rules, which means you can do a little bit. But they were still quite strict. You know, there were quite strict limits on how much you could do. Michael Gove has triggered a backlash over plans to let homeowners build extensions with no planning permission. The consultation on permitted development rights was published yesterday, and it means you can build wider and taller extensions without planning consent. So you can have an L-shaped wraparound. So that's if you've got a side return on your house, or you've got, space between the house and the boundary, then you can fill it, you can build on it. That applies to terraced houses as well, not just semis or detached houses. It's the you know what a side return is, don't you? Do you know what a side? Do I have to explain do I have to explain everything to you? A side return, it's like an alleyway down the side of your house, right? So you knock down one wall and move it to the boundary wall, which is going to block in some of your neighbour's light and can cause some conflict with neighbours. But loft extensions, kitchen extensions will all be included. So the plan is to scrap rules that mean a home and any extension cannot make up more than 50% of the land surrounding it. Special prize for anyone who knows what the name for this is. A curtilage. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. A curtilage. Curtilage? Tomato? Farage? Curtilage. Or curtilage? Or possibly curtilage. Curtilage. It also means you'd be allowed to convert as much loft space as you want without any permission whatsoever. Now, let me rephrase that for you. Because what I've just done is tell you that you can now build a massive L-shaped wraparound, a loft conversion or a kitchen extension without any planning permissions whatsoever. They are looking at scrapping all rules that mean there is a limit on how much of the surrounding land, or cartilage, you can take up with your new development, right? This is really interesting. You know what I'm going to do now, don't you? Yeah. Try the story from the other end of the telescope, okay? Michael Gove has introduced plans that means your next-door neighbour can now build wider and taller extensions without any planning consent whatsoever. This includes L-shaped wraparounds, loft conversions and kitchen extensions. Your next-door neighbour will no longer be required to limit any extensions to just 50% of the land surrounding. They will be able to build on anything. If I've read this story correctly, you could build on your entire garden. Now, I am not an expert on these matters. And anyway, Michael Gove's had enough of experts, as we know. But this seems to me to be one of the worst ideas I have ever heard of in my life. Not only do the current rules leave the doors open for disputes, we have had one ourselves in the distant past. Had an extraordinary experience. And I don't think, unless it's happened to you, I don't think that the discombobulating nature of a dispute with a neighbour over a planning issue can be fully understood unless you've gone through it. Because it impinges upon that notion of dominion, you know, that notion of security. The Englishman's home is his castle and all that gubbins. But when you come home and close the door, we talk about this quite a lot. I think I'm a bit obsessed with it because I went to boarding school. Where you come home and you close the door and you are home and dry. You are safe. But if you're in dispute with your neighbours, there's a niggle there that shouldn't be there at all. And if your neighbours have built something that you hate, which has never thankfully happened to me, if your neighbours have built something that you hate, if they've blocked out your light by putting up a wall, then your home will never be the same again. There was a terrible story about a month ago about a bloke whose neighbours had essentially sort of built so close to his house that where once there had been a passage you could walk down, there was now about 1.5 inches of space, and they'd broken planning rules, but the rigmarole involved in getting them to take it down or knock it down again is extraordinary. So the plan is to let your neighbour, or you, essentially build whatever they want on the land that they own, regardless of the impact that it has upon your home. I presume you can't just throw up a 4-storey house in your back garden and stick it on the market. But if it's an extension of your own property, there seems to me to be something of a free-for-all on what you are entitled to do. And the Mail, normally swimming in slightly different directions, but they're pretty clear that this would essentially create a civil war. It won't work, says a chartered surveyor, quoted in the newspaper. If you let neighbours make these changes to their properties without controlling it, you'll create a civil war. It just won't work. Some of the other ideas are worth a look at. They're talking about building on converting offices into homes and building on green belt sites or brownfield sites, I think, rather than green belt sites. It's all a bit of a mess, isn't it? And again, you find yourself thinking, why are you doing this now? We've had 14 years. And the rationale for it is that it would provide a boost to small and medium-sized developers. That's the brownfield stuff. And I suppose letting people build whatever they want on their own property would let people do the it would let builders. You can see the economic boost for that sort of thing. I just want to know whether this is as stupid as it looks. And I need to know from two types of people, either people that are more across the facts than we are, 0345 6060 973, or people who can already relate just how damaging to your own domestic harmony, your own domestic peace, a neighbour's building projects can be. I like these. Do you know that we once did a phone-in? This is 100 years ago, and it makes me think of Steve Wright, actually, because he loved... Danny Baker put it quite beautifully in a tweet last night. When if you love radio, whether you work in it or not, you'll know what he's talking. It says 95% of the people you hear on the radio are just that. They're on the radio. They're no more than that. To work the radio, to master and elevate radio, to play with it and extend the possibilities of radio, to swoop and soar with the medium. That's the trick. Steve Wright knew that. Steve Wright did that. I'll share some more thoughts on Steve Wright in a moment. But whenever something extraordinary happens on the programme that has very little to do with me, if anything, I do think of Steve Wright. And that's why it was so sad to hear of his horribly early death last night. And one of the things that makes me think of Steve Wright, he would do it with carefully produced and scripted characters. We sometimes do it randomly. We get called, that could have been... We had a woman who rang in to complain about the building work that was being done next door. Do you remember this? It was about 10 years ago. And it started while she was on the phone. And we thought she'd been exaggerating about how loud it was. But we couldn't hear what she was saying. On the phone, we couldn't hear what she... And I said, are you having to put up with that every day? I think it was like a... Have we got that? Is that still anywhere in the archives? It was just extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. But that oddly made me think of Steve Wright, because that's what Danny's talking about, those moments of radio where it just seems to go somewhere that you weren't expecting it to go. So it's something that we've covered a little bit in the past, but the prospect of being able to, this person warns that, in fact, the Tory party MP, the Tory MP, is worried that it might open the door to 3-storey extensions on the backs of houses. In fact, the Tories are getting a little bit NIMBY-ish about it, because I suppose they're worried about what it might do to their vote. But here it is. Two questions, really. Do these proposals look as mad as Tory MP Greg Smith suggests? Are we really looking at the prospect of an extra 3-storey extension being built on the back of a house? And question number 2, even as the things are now, even with permitted developments now, how much stress can a neighbour's development bring into your life? Within the rules. Obviously, if you've got stories about them breaking the rules, that's interesting as well. But it may not be as exciting. But I am more interested initially in things that are within the rules that ruin your life. 0345 6060 973. It's 12:19. 22 minutes after 12 is the time. My 17-year-old son, says Eva in Hammersmith, often refers to a poor pass or tackle on the football pitch as a Brexit move. The same applies to anything silly. I have to admit that it made me laugh out loud when I first heard it, and it gives me great hope that it's something he's picked up at school. It is, Eva. It's a thing. It's even in the Urban Dictionary. When kids do something awful to each other, they call it a Brexit move. Or even if they're heading in for a 2-footed tackle designed to break someone's ankle, they shout, Brexit means Brexit. Of course, it's not completely accurate. To be completely accurate, they'd have to be breaking their own ankles while shouting Brexit means Brexit, which brings me to a Goldman Sachs report today that you are unlikely to be told about by any of the people that encouraged you to vote for Brexit, or Boris Johnson, or Liz Truss. Or Theresa May, I suppose. Not that the choices were very attractive at the time, but the Goldman Sachs Bank, which is where Rishi Sunak, of course, used to work, they have reported today that the UK is currently underperforming other advanced economies significantly underperformed other advanced economies because of Brexit. So the UK economy is worse off today than before Brexit, to the tune of about 5%. The decision to leave the European Union has hampered the economy compared to other comparable countries. There's nothing for Goldman Sachs, there's nothing in it for them to lie. The Wall Street Bank attributed the shortfall to 3 key factors. Can you guess what they were? In 1, reduced trade. In 2, weaker business investment. And in 3, lower immigration from the EU. So that is why the UK is currently underperforming comparable economies to the tune of about 5%, according to the bank that everybody says Rishi Sunak must be good with figures because he used to work for. 24 after 12 is the time. Back to planning. Carol is in Epping Forest. Carol, what can you tell me?
So it's quite awful. The things that you are allowed to do
already. It's already. But Michael Gove is ripping up the things that limit what you can currently do.
No, you can already do quite a lot as just without even going in front of a planning committee. It just you're allowed to do it.
That's curtilage.
No, you say you can do a 6. I think it's. I almost don't want to tell you about this because
in case everyone listening goes out and does it.
Yeah, because I've got a creative background, and I said, you know what, we could sell this to Channel 4 as a series, and basically what we do, we get the team to go along and
they're not commissioning, Carol.
Start building it, and then just watch people's faces when they realise what is going on next door, and they realise that it's not even needed to have planning permission for.
Like what?
It is horrific. Well, I mean, like a 6-metre extension.
6 metres high?
No, 6 metres deep.
So 6 metres into the garden.
Exactly, and if you've got two neighbours doing that either side, it's like you're wearing blinkers. You're trapped in a tunnel. You can usually go up to.
That's happened to my mum actually, but only with conservatories, and that's bad enough.
Yeah, it is. It is awful, and then you'll get something that's and we're not normally allowed to comment on those. This is deemed for information only.
Well, who's we? Who's we? From what perspective are you speaking?
Planning committees.
Oh, Lord. So you're on a local planning committee and you think that the current rules are far too lax.
Exactly.
So what on earth?
We can't say anything about it.
Well, you're on you do know you're on live national radio, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think of Michael Gove's plan to get rid of the rules that are already too lax and replace them with a bloody free-for-all, Carol?
I think it's heading up to an election. And I think that's what it is.
But this is going to backfire because all you have to do is say your neighbours are going to do it. You might win a vote by saying you can do it, but your neighbours can. So as you understand it, would I be able to build an extension on my entire garden?
No, you couldn't, because then it's you're up to 50%. If you go over 50%,
they're ripping that up. Pay attention.
Oh no!
It lays out plans
just go on Google Earth. Look at East London. Carry on, and you'll see gardens that have completely disappeared. And what are they doing in those gardens?
But
who knows?
They've probably got crack dens. That's a 50% limit at the moment. But that's what they're getting rid of. So
no, you don't want that.
No, let me read it to you. Goodness me, you're supposed to be educating me, Carol. It lays out plans. This is the consultancy that
I haven't read this. I'm sorry.
I'm telling you now. It lays out plans to scrap rules that mean a home and any extension cannot make up more than 50% of the land surrounding it, known as the curtilage. That's in the bin, Carol.
Yeah, naughty.
Naughty? It's worse than naughty.
Yeah. I mean, I must say, I'm not a national party, and I'm on very local politics. I'm not on the one that makes all the decisions. We just give a steer.
Okay.
But it wrecks people's lives.
Yes.
It really wrecks people's lives. It is awful. And the idea is that they do not want to. Ideally, they don't want things to go in front of a committee. Because it's not NIMBYism.
No,
I mean,
it's environmental. It's environmental management, and what's the limit on height? How high can you go? As high as the house, or
usually it'll be. I mean, if it's like a first floor, it might have a pitched roof, and then it'll
go down. But if they're getting rid of that, they're getting rid of how deep you can go and how high you can go. Do you think I'll be able to build a windmill?
I don't know.
I've always wanted a windmill.
Not pull it down. But the thing is, it's people aren't even getting planning permission. The number of people building things without planning. We've had people building swimming pools without planning permission. They just start building.
I wouldn't mind that much, would I? Would it be that annoying to have a swimming pool next door to you?
Well, it would be if they ripped down all the mature trees on the boundary, and then they built their swimming pool up to the fence.
No, that's a very good point. There is a reason why all of these rules are in place and why people like you are so necessary in giving steers. Carol, come back a minute. You're going to have to swat up on this, aren't you?
Well, we're already quite swatted. I mean,
you're not swatted enough, madam. Michael Gove is ripping up the rules that you think are already a travesty.
But can I just say, we're local. So local politics, not district, the one below.
So it's local planning for local people.
Local, exactly. And we don't even have the final say. So we can just give a steer because we know what everything is. But we can't stop it. If it goes to the district,
then that's it. It's game over. Swimming pools all round. And au revoir, curtilage. Well, mes amis, Carol, thank you. And this is a Tory responding to a Tory. That's when you know you've got a problem. Greg Smith, whose constituency covers rural Buckinghamshire, said he supported small extensions without planning permission, but there must be limits. This does have the potential to pit neighbour against neighbour, as if we're getting into the realms of an extra 3-storey extension on the backs of houses. And as Carol just pointed out, it's bad enough if it's 1 storey. If you've got it on both sides, so you've got a lovely patio, you sit out there in the summer, catches a bit of sun as it's making its way overhead, possibly have a cocktail, read a book, and then both sides build extensions. What have you got? You're sitting in the dark. Your patio will be green by August. Won't be getting any sunlight, be covered in lit. Oh, man alive, honestly. I don't like the look of this. 12:30 is the time. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. It is indeed 12:34 on LBC, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So some of the other stories, we'll get stuck back. Michael Gove, I think, has dropped another clanger. What an interesting politician Michael Gove is. He occasionally does something that makes you think he's quite sensible. Don't at me. He does. Pay attention. And then he does absolutely awful things. He pops up in How They Broke Britain, actually, as an example of inconsistency and lack of integrity. Do you remember when he pulled out of Boris Johnson's original leadership campaign? There's a phrase you don't hear very often. He pulled out of Boris Johnson's original leadership campaign because he decided that Boris Johnson was utterly unfit to be Prime Minister, and then served in Boris Johnson's cabinet when his second leadership campaign proved successful, almost as if he didn't really believe in anything except self-advancement. But this looks pretty bad. James, what you have just said, writes Andy, just in case you don't realise how serious this is, about building regulations is one of the most horrific things I have heard in years. This is just awful, and it will be so stressful to so many people who have selfish neighbours. When purchasing a home now, it will mean you have to work out what could be built in the future that could be so awful you realise you cannot take the risk and then buy the house. Imagine chilling in your garden, and then either side of you is a massive erection looking over you from next door. He wrote extension, but you can take the boy out of the Carry On films. No? All right, then. It's easy to say you can build 6 metres long without permission, but actually you have to comply with permitted development rules, and they are currently 64 pages long and really complicated. You're in a tiny minority there, whoever sent that. Everyone else is united in their concern. Hi, James, I'm a planning consultant. I'll read that a bit later. It's a bit dry. And here's a planning officer. I can tell you that this would be a nightmare. A major part of our job is dealing with neighbourly disputes, and this would make it even worse. People want the right to build something themselves, but don't want anyone else to be able to. And clip this up, Ava. This right there is a definition of modern conservatism. You've done it. That's it. That's modern conservatism. People want the right to build something for themselves, but they don't want anyone else to be able to. That's it, isn't it? That is post-2010 conservatism. Oh, I didn't mean you. That is the best distillation. That might make the paperback. That is the best distillation of the current iteration of the Tory party that I have ever seen. That is precisely who they are and who they appeal to. People who want to be able to build something for themselves, but they don't want anybody else to be able to, least of all their neighbours. Danny's in Stonehouse in Gloucestershire. Danny, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, blimey. I'm an architect, so I deal with this stuff day in, day out, residential extensions on jobs. Gove, as usual, is talking complete and utter nonsense.
Well, you're one of those experts. We've had enough of you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I've only been doing it for 40-odd years. The fact of the matter is that the regulations over extensions on residential properties have been getting easier over time. But there are still safeguards in place to prevent people from losing daylight, losing amenity, and having enormous things built next to their garden that's going to ruin the enjoyment of their property. So I can't see how this can possibly work. It sounds like another bit of red meat again that these people are always.
Yeah, but who does it
around.
appeal to? Unless that texter's just knocked it out of the park, it appeals to people who want to build something themselves but don't want anybody else to be able to. So they.
Well, absolutely. You know, it's the idea that there's no community anymore. You don't actually give a damn what your neighbours think about what you do. It's just I want this and that's it. I have extensions refused at planning. This isn't permitted development. This is at planning for reasons that sometimes don't make sense to the person, the applicant.
Right.
But they are safeguards put in place by planning officers, not planning committees. Planning committees don't deal with residential stuff, so we can forget that. And parish councils have their say, which is what the lady said earlier on, I think. She must have been involved in that. But they're made by planning officers to protect neighbours.
Yeah, community, harmony.
And it's as simple as that. And I cannot see how this can possibly work.
Sometimes we cover stories on the programme, quite a lot in recent years, and you can't actually understand how it's ever seen the light of day. Can you? Well, and you're an architect, so in a way this could create more work for you, so you should welcome it.
Well, absolutely, but I mean, I have a conscience as well, and I have a duty to people, you know, not to do things which are ugly and hideous. I can't say everybody in my profession feels the same way as me.
Clearly not. Anyway, enough about that. How much for a windmill?
Well, you'll have to come and see me.
I bet you've never done one, though.
No, I haven't, because there's not much call for windmills these days.
Well, that's part of the problem. We're turning bills into mills over here. That's what we're doing. I build a windmill.
We'll build anything. We'll design anything. Just, I'll leave my phone number with your research.
I don't know if my neighbours will thank you for it, Danny. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? So there you go. I've got planning officers, planning consultants queuing up to condemn it. I've got an architect condemning it. They'll all get more work out of it. So what's Michael Gove playing at? There's a question for the ages. 0345 6060 973. Dawn, you're next, but I just want to take a couple of minutes now because otherwise I'll forget. You know what I'm like, and I don't want to forget. And I just want to say how sad I am to hear of the passing of Steve Wright, who for many people is the essence of what we somewhat pompously might call creative radio. And I am going to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about him. And my encounters with him, which were magical. You listen to him at school. We used to have Steve Wright on in break. If you were skiving rugby, you'd be listening to Steve Wright. And what you didn't realise, until you had the privilege of getting to know him, was that the attention to detail on that programme, which often sounded, all of his programmes on Radio 1, on Radio 2, they often sounded improvised, off the cuff. It was the polar opposite. It was his programs, his radio programs, were choreographed like the finest ballet. Every dot and comma was edited and pared back to the point of perfection. What he did on the radio was extraordinary. Kenny Everett, in the early days of Capital and later at Radio 1, pushed the envelope. Steve Wright picked up the envelope and used origami to turn it into a beautiful flower. I think he'd have quite liked that. It's a bit partridgey, that description, but I think he would have quite liked that. And when you work in radio, you discover, as countless radio presenters have done, I don't want to spoil it for anyone because it makes us all feel very special, but if he rated your work, he would let you know. He would go out of his way as an ambassador of the medium to let you know that he rated your work. And it was like a sort of papal blessing. It was like something being handed down from the Vatican when that happened. And if you ever had the privilege of going on his shows, all you could do, even if you were a moderately successful radio presenter yourself, all you could do was sit there and wonder. Just sit there in wonder at his mastery, not of a craft, because it's a craft for some of us, and for the very special few that you don't get to decide whether you're in or not. That's up to other people. For a very special few, radio is an art form, not a craft. It's beyond journalism or playing records or whatever it is, and it goes to places that a tiny number of professionals can go to. So I'm spoilt for choice, really, when it comes to examples, and I don't know that I want to play you his voice because I think it will break me a bit. But I do want to play you a little bit of music and then tell you a story about it that for me sums up Steve Wright. And you may not know this story. It's a little bit special, but you may recognise by the Lightning Seeds or Graham Brodie. It's called Pure. It's an absolutely beautiful song. And Steve loved love songs. I got this story off Pete Perfides, the music writer and author. Steve loved love songs. His Sunday morning show on Radio 2 was the sort of go-to spot for people who love songs. And who doesn't love a love song? The first time Steve played that on the radio, do you know what he did? I've never played music on the radio properly, so I don't appreciate how this is the kind of thing that can get you in trouble with bosses, and the more prescriptive a station is, the more trouble it would get you into. So he's playing it on the radio for the first time, and he's halfway through the song, a truly beautiful song. Do you know what he did? He pressed stop and started it again. He said, I want to hear that again. And he just went back to the beginning and played the song again, which is precisely what Danny Baker was talking about last night when he described the precious, precious few people on the radio who elevate it, who play with it, who extend the possibilities, who swoop and soar with the medium. And Danny Baker wrote, that's the trick. Steve Wright knew that. Steve Wright did that. And he was a very voracious reader. He actually, do you know what he was? He was an inhaler of culture, Steve Wright. If you ever spoke to him, and I only had the privilege of speaking to him a few times, I get a bit starstruck, you know. If someone says, we must have lunch at my club, he invited me to lunch to the RAC club, and I was a bit too nervous and I wasn't sure he meant it, and I realised what a stupid boy I was. I should have bitten his arm off. But I didn't go, and I wish I had. But he was so erudite. He had such an astonishing range of reference. He'd read everything. You could tell by the guests. You go on his programme. I went on with my first book. He'd read every word. He had post-it notes coming out of his ears. You often hear authors being interviewed on the radio where it's clear the presenter hasn't read the book. Steve had almost memorised it. So respectful and so generous, so kind and so generous. So I think he'd appreciate this, which is a reminder of what the great Douglas Adams once said about creating art. And it came to my mind when I read what Danny Baker wrote about swooping and soaring with the medium. And what Douglas Adams said was that sometimes when things are going brilliantly well, then the art of creating, the business of creating, is like throwing yourself at the floor and missing. You just soar off into the stratosphere. And there will never be another radio presenter who does that every single time he gets behind the microphone. God bless, mate. It is 10 to 1. Come on, James. Can you stop talking about windmills unless you're thinking of getting into the flour milling business? They are wind turbine generators, WTGs. Thanks, says Adrian in Manchester. Well, come here a minute, Adrian. The problem with that is that I realised halfway through waxing lyrical about wanting a windmill in my back garden, particularly because one of the adverts we're carrying at the moment, that people would think that that's what I meant. Like, instead of a heat pump, I'll get a windmill on the roof. But I didn't mean that. I meant something like what Windy Miller has in Camberwick Green. I've always really liked, if I can't have a windmill, I'd want a lighthouse. Can I have a lighthouse in my back garden? If you're just tuning in, Michael Gove wants everyone to build lighthouses in their back garden. I may be exaggerating slightly, but only slightly, judging by the response to reports that he is planning to let homeowners build extensions as big as they like with no planning permission whatsoever. Dawn is in Silvertown. Dawn, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I heard... hello.
Hello.
I just turned on the radio and heard about what Gove's been saying.
I didn't mean literally what made you pick up the phone. I mean literally, you say, well, I was listening to a radio phone-in, right? And this bloke said, phone in. And so I did. I meant, what is the thing in your life that is relevant to the thing what the bloke on the radio is talking about?
My parents' house.
Yes.
Basically, they've lived there 50 plus years. Their neighbours have bought up 4 or 5 houses on either side.
Yeah.
And essentially, they've gone up as far as they could, which is, I think, is 2 stories. They've gone out as far as they could in the back garden.
Oh.
And not only that, they've built outhouses on both sides. And this is the one. On the right-hand side, they built a 10-foot breeze block wall where there used to be a little chain-link fence.
Oh, Lord.
10-foot breeze block. The outhouses are all breeze block. And so my mum and dad's beautiful little garden is sort of overshadowed. And
so that's about... I think this studio... I know you can't see me, but the studio would be not as high as 10 foot, is it? If I can touch the ceiling, I'm 6 foot. My arm's not 4 foot long, is it?
It was huge.
No. Well, and have they tried to object, or have they tried to ask the neighbours what they're playing at?
Our parents are really easygoing, but
sure, but everyone's got their limits.
And complained,
yeah.
And the council made them remove a couple of lines of the breeze block,
and that was it.
And that was it. But this is, I mean, it's overkill. A breeze block wall where they're build a fence, a wooden fence.
Something nice. So that's the point, isn't it? So there are things you can do, and there are things that you shouldn't do, and things that you shouldn't be able to do that you can do. But an unadorned, unplastered breeze block wall, that is just almost giving the finger to you. It's flicking a bird at your neighbours, isn't it? Really, it's saying, I don't care about you. This is your new view.
Yep, totally. And on the front, they've paved over. I mean, it's literally everything they can pave or concrete.
Do we know why they've done it? Do we know why they've done it?
It's space. I think they've got family living there, possibly not meant to. But at the front, they covered it as well. I think there's a huge, huge tree, and I think they tried to get that removed for their drive, so they couldn't get a drop down. So they still paved over them because they own all the houses. They use it as their own public little
car
parking area,
and the fact, and your mum and dad can do absolutely nothing about it, and that's under the rules as they currently are. These are the rules that Michael Gove wants to get rid of.
And what made me laugh is a bit like, if you can imagine a little Lego block, I reckon they would build in that little section between the extension and the outhouse. I reckon they would build there and build up. So literally, and it reminds me of, in a Disney film where they have the tiny little dinky house in the middle and the two on either side. It sort of reminds me of that a bit. I can't think what film it is.
No, and you've lost me a bit there, Dawn, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it might be Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, when they have the little... Sorry,
no, you mean the house in the middle of... So where Charlie's house is in the middle of a...
Yeah,
he's got a tiny little house. That does ring a vague bell. Well, I'll tell you what, we're not buying this, are we, Dawn? And the idea of having your peace disrupted by neighbours who are behaving with a degree of contempt, but in the future with the complete support of the law. I mean, as I say, Michael Gove supposed to be an intelligent man, they keep telling me. But Rupert Murdoch thinks he's an intelligent man. So intelligent that he sat in on the interview that Michael Gove did with Donald Trump shortly after Donald Trump became president, without anybody being told at the time that Rupert Murdoch was sitting in on the interview. That's how intelligent he thinks he is. Jason is teasing Dawn a bit here with this. What made you pick up the phone? Well, my brain sent a neurological signal to the neuromuscular junctions with various muscles where acetylcholine was released and connected to a receptor that caused the muscles to contract, enabling me to pick up the phone. People get nervous, Jason. I say to Dawn, why have you picked up the phone? She thinks, why have you picked up the phone? Not what do you want to say? Why have you picked up the phone? It was ringing. What do you mean it was ringing? 12:55 is the time. Kevin's in Mill Hill. Kevin, what would you like to say?
James, I agree with all the other callers. There's more than enough regulations to allow people to build monstrous great.
What's he playing at? What's he
extensions.
playing at, Kevin?
Well, he's going to allow people to build over back gardens. That's going to increase flooding, cause all sorts of problems.
What's the plus for it? If he was sitting here now and said, but what you and Kevin don't realise is the ... what would he say?
I can't see any pluses at all.
Well,
You can put multiple applications in under permitted development and building regulations to extend houses, build big portal cabins in the roof to extend your loft. And the trouble is, if you start making houses bigger and bigger instead of moving, because moving is very expensive,
oh, that's true.
all the cheap houses are going to disappear, and people aren't going to move, and then there's going to be no houses for.
Well, hang on, where are all the
to
cheap houses going to go? They're going to become they're going to become bigger, therefore less cheap.
Less cheap. And then
not some of these new
afford
developments. You can't put a cigarette paper down between them, so they're not going to be.
Yeah, but where we live, there's loads of new developments, and it's not long before people want to convert the garages to accommodation, build extensions out the back to make.
But is this not one way of maybe Michael Gove would say this is one way of solving the housing crisis, so that people won't need to move; they can just build a bigger house.
Build a bigger house, but then where are the first-time buyers going to buy their houses?
Yeah. That's a good question. What's your perspective, Kev? What will you say? Who are you speaking for or of?
Well, we live in a nice area in Mill Hill. We're very lucky. We're near the Green Belt. And
are there any windmills in Mill Hill?
There used to be.
Well, that's where it got the name from, isn't it?
There's some nearby.
Was it on a hill?
We're on a hill, yes. That's what we need. We need a new windmill in Mill Hill.
A windmill for Mill Hill. We could start a campaign. Get the tourists in. That'd be fantastic. But so you're in some sort of planning group, are you?
We're on the Mill Hill Preservation Society.
Just trying to keep Mill Hill all pristine and nice for the future. I'm a big fan of that kind of behaviour. Guys, squeezing Keighley in Epping, or have we not got time? I like to go from Kevin to Keighley because I'm a fan of alliteration. From Mill Hill to Epping. Can you do it in 42 seconds, Keighley, do you think?
I can, just very briefly.
Go on.
I'm a building surveyor, and I don't agree, with the proposal.
I found one person who thinks it's a good idea.
But what I would say, there are other areas of law that neighbours would have redress to.
Oh, well done.
Under planning, there is a consideration for daylight and sunlight for planning applications. And I think that also applies for permitted development. Neighbours do have an opportunity to provide comments to the planning authority, although a limited period. But there's also something called rights of light, which...
So don't despair. I did say 42 seconds, but rights of light is something people need to look up. Don't despair, although the report is described as a wider shake-up of planning rules that mean permission for homes will be automatically granted in urban areas that do not meet their building targets. There you go. That's what Michael Gove would say. I'm helping areas meet their building targets. Thank you, Keighley. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody. If you missed any of today's show, and I think, did Keith? Come here. I think I did a record number of hooks and teases where I remembered to deliver the punchline today. Do you? Look at that, 20 years in the job and improving every day. If you missed any of today's show, thank you very much. Thank you, fans. You can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 Now it's time for Sheila